What is going on, everyone? I've already made a video very similar to this, but I'm making this new one to follow up with the Night Fork edition, and this one's more aimed at the novice player. The progression is going to be a lot slower, and hopefully you can get out of this how to use your pieces to the best of their ability to checkmate the opposing king before they can slide out of the position. With that being said, let's get this going. It is white to move, and I will give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need it. 1, 2, and 3. The move is simply rook to e8, checkmate. It is white to move. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need it. 1, 2, and 3. The best move here is queen to d8, checkmate. It is white to move. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need it. 1, 2, and 3. You should notice that you have a bishop and the black king is protecting the square that the rook should be able to go and check the king. So if you move the bishop to d6, that leaves the king only one square to move, and that's inward behind the pawns to g8. Once the king moves, now that allows you to bring your rook safely to e8 for checkmate. It is white to move, and I will give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. This is very similar to the previous puzzle because we use a different piece other than the rook to move the king away from the square we need to bring the rook. So by bringing the knight to d7, the king only has one option, and that's to back away from the e8 square. Once the king does so, you are free to bring your rook to e8 for checkmate. White to move. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. Just like the other previous examples we just went through with the bishop and the knight, sometimes you need to move the king in the position where you can back rank check them. And in this case, we can move the queen to h5, forcing the king to the g8 square. Once the king is in the position where they can be choked out on the back rank, we are free to move our rook to e8 for checkmate. It is white to move, and in these next examples, we are introducing a defender for Team Black. We'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. Rook to b8 checks the black king, and the black queen has 3 squares it can go to get in between and stop the check. Regardless of which square they choose, the rook can then capture the black queen, finishing the job and ending in checkmate. Just like the previous example, black has a piece for the defense. It's white to move, and we will give you 3 seconds to pause the video. 1, 2, and 3. The solution to this position is bringing your first rook to e8 for check, and unlike the last position, not only can black's defender get in between to stop the check, but it can actually capture your first wave of attack. Once the rook captures your rook on e8, then you can bring in your second wave to capture them, ending in checkmate. Black's defender does not always have to be on the back rank to interfere with your plans. It is white to move, and we'll give you 3 seconds to pause if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. The proper sequence in this scenario is first rook to e8 for check. The black king can't move, so it must bring in a defender to put in between the check. Queen to f8 does just that. But if you notice, you have a knight now that can jump in to e7, checking the black king. The black queen cannot capture the knight because it is pinned from the rook, so the black king must back up to h8. Once the king has moved out of the way, not protecting the queen anymore, that allows you to capture the queen with your rook for checkmate. Black's defenders come in all shapes and forms. It's white to move, and we'll give you 3 seconds, as always, to pause the video if you need. 1, 2, and 3. The answer to this solution may be surprising. Rook to e8 check is the first move. and since the black king has no squares to move to that get out of check, it must block the check. Its only piece to do so is bishop to f8. Not all moves need to be a forcing move, so by placing your bishop on h6, that allows black to make a move that's not forced. Their options are moving the king to the h8 square, the corner, since they can no longer move their king to the g7 square. They can move their pawn that's on the g file up a space, or they can move their pawn on the f file up 1 or 2. Regardless of what they choose, you can then take your rook and capture the bishop for checkmate. It is white to move, and we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. Sometimes when you make your initial move and check the black king, your first piece does get captured. The proper move is queen to e8 check. The black king has no spaces to evade the check, so they must either block the check or capture the piece putting the king in check. Here, the black rook on a8 can capture the queen. Once the black rook captures the queen, that leaves you with a rook on e1 to capture the rook on e8 for checkmate. Almost identical to the previous example, only the king is on f8 instead of g8. White to move will give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. The previous example, we brought the queen to e8, the rook captured, and we recaptured for checkmate, but here it doesn't work because the king has access to the e8 square. What we can do to move the king away from accessing the e8 square is first checking the king by going queen to e7. The king can't capture the queen because it's guarded by the rook, so the king must back out to g8. Once the king has moved, we are free to do what we did in the previous example, checking the king with queen to e8. The rook will recapture, and we will recapture for checkmate. Sometimes the opposing king may have more than one piece, helping defend it. White to move will give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need to. 1, 2, and 3. This is called an Alekhine gun, when you have 3 pieces, combination between rooks and queens. First move, queen e8 check, forcing the first rook to come in and capture. Then you can take your first rook and recapture their rook. Their second rook can capture your first rook, and then you can come in with the knockout blow with your last rook e8 checkmate. Just because I couldn't resist, white to move and checkmate. I'm not giving you any time, you should know. Pawn e8 promotion to queen or rook, check. Queen captures queen, queen captures queen, rook captures queen, rook captures rook, rook captures rook, rook captures rook, checkmate. Ooh yeah. Sometimes the pieces defending the king are also defended by the king. White to move will give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need. 1, 2, and 3. There's always more than one way to skin a cat, but there's always the most efficient way. Queen to f7 checks the king. If the king were to just move out of the way of check, then the queen could capture the rook for checkmate. So black's best option is to capture the queen. From this position, we can take our rook that's away from the action, bring it to the back row on the a8 square, checking the black king. Black king has no squares to move to, so it must block the check. Unfortunately, now 2 pieces are attacking that rook, so you can take either one, regardless if it's the rook on f1 or a8, and capture that rook for checkmate. Similar situation, we'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video if you need. 1, 2, and 3. Sometimes, when you come in for the attack initially, when black captures your attacking piece, it gets stuck. Because now, the rook is pinned because you have a bishop on a2. And it's your turn. You can bring a rook down on the back row, b8, and that is in fact checkmate, since the king has no legal squares to move to, and the rook that's on f7 is pinned and cannot block the king this time.